let's begin with the starting point. Lazaris words. Human beings, you and I on a journey, coming home, going home. I think he's reversed those, first on a journey, going home, now on a journey, coming home. That, in a sense, there's an elliptic. There's a starting point, a moving away point, and a coming back. Now, the sphere, the circle, is the most elegant shape in geometry. And so, as with the breath, the exhale sets the stage for the inhale, sets the stage for an exhale. So we have a rhythm. And it's a multidimensional rhythm which creates this spherical shape. So, what is home? And to my knowledge, or to my recollection, Lazaris hasn't talked that much about it. And Lazaris has talked about things such as all beliefs are true, so pick the ones that work. Or your negative ego always lies to you. That's the nature of the negative ego. Now, the negative aspect, as Lazaris is creating a partition. So we have ego, the lens through which to view reality. And then we have the division, the partition, and then we have a plus and a negative. Now, all ecologists, all scientists will tell you that everything is connected. In other words, that this plus and this minus is illusionary in the concept of it being wholly separate. That if you take the one, divide it into two, and now you have the right and the left, that they're actually interdependent. You cannot have the right without the left. It's meaningless. So they are created through the bifurcation of language. Now, this would suggest that you cannot have a negative ego. If there is no positive ego, you cannot have a positive ego if there is no negative ego. You cannot have good without bad. These are words that take the one and divide them into polarity. Now, I think another way of saying that the negative ego is always lying to you is that ego is always lying, and ego is always telling the truth. That there is a polarizing face that can be seen, that everything can be seen within the framework of a polarity, or as an interconnected ecology. Now, the illusion of polarity becomes obvious when you examine the science of the polarity. For example, the illusion that life or birth is the opposite of death and dying becomes obvious. The illusion becomes obvious when you understand that in order to be born, something needs to die. In order for energy to take a new form, the old form has to dissolve within a given moment of time and space, right? So you could say death is the closest thing to birth rather than the farthest thing. That a lie is the closest thing to truth rather than the farthest thing. And you also have continuums. You have the fact that on the continuum of truth, which is another way of saying the continuum of perfection, which is another way of saying the continuum of reality. We're talking about the quality of the map, but we're not actually, you can never get to reality. There's, we can talk about something like this, and we can say this is a hand. We can say this is made of fingers, and the fingers are made of atoms or molecules, and the molecules are made of atoms. The atoms are made of subatomic. And by this point, we already can't see. All those molecules, those atoms, those subatomic particles moving constantly, breathing constantly, spinning constantly, are so fast, we no longer see them. In other words, the truest truth, to see every single subatomic particle and then every subatomic particle or every subatomic particle of the subatomic particle, and see all of that spinning endlessly. You could say, well, that's the truth, and you never get there, right? There's no end. It just gets more and more distinct the more you look into that fractal pattern. It's like one of those fractal generating machines. So language itself is a map of reality. And as a map, it is a lie because it is an imperfect lie. It is an imperfect map, which makes it an imperfect lie because the map isn't reality, right? When you tell Google, I want to go here, and it says turn right and turn left, that's not reality, turning left and turning right on these lines called streets. The streets aren't really called zither street. It's an area in space and time that a map has been superimposed. And it's a very limited map. It's not very real. So when we're dealing in the domain of language, we are dealing in the domain of illusion. But it's a continuum of illusion. Because we can look at a street map for the wrong city, and that's a deeper illusion, meaning it's an illusion, but it's not the illusion that has anything to do with this city. It's an illusion for another city. So if you follow and look for Zither Street in San Francisco, but you're looking at a map for Los Angeles, you may find Zither Street. And if you turn left and turn right, you will not get to Zither Street. You'll get to a place that isn't Zither Street. But on the map, it says you've taken the right and left turns, right? And so then, where are you, right? The map says this is Zither Street. The street sign, which is another map, right? They don't line up. The street signs have nothing to do with the location. It's just a label, affixed on a given point in space and time. So you have a delusion that doesn't fit, that doesn't jive with other delusions, because you have two maps. You have the paper map or the digital map, and then you have the signs, and that's another map, neither of which are real, meaning you just made it up. You just stuck a sign on some straight bit of pavement and called it Zither Street. You could call it Pither Street. It's nothing, right? It's just a reference point. And so it's not real. And that's what words are. They take you to a given point in psychological space-time, which in many cases doesn't line up with other people's psychological space-time. They're in a different city. They're in a different paradigm. And there's no mention of that. And so as they take a left turn and a right turn and this turn and that turn, they end up, very discombobulated right at the point you think they've arrived, right? And so you have two people subscribing to different illusionary maps of reality and not being able to tell where the illusions bifurcate and ending up in different places and wondering what's going on. So every belief is true. Pick the ones that work. Well, works for what? We all want to experience sustainable well-being, and we all want to avoid chronic and unnecessary suffering. So the beliefs that bring us towards sustainable well-being are the beliefs that are a closer map to reality than the beliefs that lead us to chronic and unnecessary suffering. But here you have a lot of context, right? If you're a Jew in a Nazi concentration camp and you fail to sort out the gold fillings from your dead relatives who have been murdered and cremated, then you die. And to the extent that you have a correlation with the idea that death is somehow a failure, or you didn't learn your lesson, or death is giving in, or whatever it is, you have maps around death and maps around life, then it seems like if I don't help the Nazis, then my suffering will go up. In abusive families all across the planet, if you tell the truth to the abuser who is asking for a collusion in a lie, you get beaten, maybe shot, maybe humiliated, maybe tormented for 1, 2, 3 years. So as you are bribed to go insane in order to avoid the trauma, is that better or worse? Do you look at the short term or do you look at the long term? You could say that's not true. I'm going to take a stand and I'm willing to die for it. I'm not going to go along with these lies. But in a sick environment that rewards compliance, don't tell your mother, this will be our little secret, and you'll get a lollipop. Things will go well for you. You just have to step into an alternate world where words don't mean what they mean in the dictionary. And you'll be lost off in some alternate world in which your abuser is your friend, and your friend is your abuser, because your friend could get you found out, right? Your friend wants to know what's really going on, but what's really going on could get you traumatized. So is your friend your abuser, or is your abuser your friend? Please, just don't upset him anymore. Don't rock the boat, and he won't beat me as much. Get away, get away. If he sees me having friends, he will beat me. You're not my friend by being my friend. You're the one that is the cause of my beating. My abuser isn't the cause of my beating, you are. So let me placate my abuser and partition from my friends, because I'm in a different reality where I get rewarded for calling a friend an enemy and an enemy a friend. And I'll take the reward gets me through today. I can't deal with the rage, with the hostility, with the fear of this person and all that they have to carry being given to me because I have the audacity to call abuse abuse. And so I'm going to call it love. I'll just agree that we'll rewrite the names on all these streets. And we're no longer going to Zither Street. We're going to Love Street. Because that's what Daddy calls it. That's what Daddy said. And Mom looks terrified and says, shush, when I look at the lettering and it doesn't seem to say L-O-V-E. It seems to say Z-I-T-H-E-R. So, which world am I in? You know, do I have to go insane as well as be abused to a place that no one can reach me? Because once I start using the wrong words and no one can find me, now I'm in a slow descending hell with a map of reality that doesn't really work. And everyone that wants to help seems to be an enemy. And in many cases are an enemy because they don't understand the pattern. They don't understand that to get me halfway out of the abuse escalates the abuse, and they're not willing to go all the way. So they play the role that escalates the abuse and then walk away. Because in a sociopathic cult, it's not my problem. Now, all of this is ego, meaning to view the world through the lens of language, which is what we're doing, is to view the world through the lens of symbols. It's taking the vast complexity of all that is, and it's cutting it up into bits called words. I could just say, this is all that is. Or I can step into the partition of language and say, this is a hand. This is my hand, it's not your hand. It's two partitions. Now we partition the hand. This is a finger. This is a thumb. This is space between. We're doing more partitions. We're cutting the one piece by piece into language, into a map of the one perceived through or by the conscious mind, through thought, shaped by language. So we're now separate from the one, because in order to say this is this and it's not this, but it's this, and this is the one, this is me doing this about this, I have to be separate. In other words, in order to dumb reality down to the heuristic map of language, I have to be separate from that which I am naming. That is this, that is that. You are you. I am me. That's space. This is me. This is a hat. I'm not the hat, right? So once you step into language, you are viewing the world. You are viewing reality as a separate set of distinct patterns. meaning it's separate from me, it's separate from you, and each pattern is separate from the other pattern. Now, language is a somewhat tricky consciousness delusion in the sense that, like a fish doesn't know water, we don't know what it's like to be outside of language when we're in language. When we're looking through the lens and everything is a distinct pattern refracted by language, we don't know how to transcend that. We know how to say words about transcending it, but we don't actually know how to transcend the language, and thus, inside the language, we don't see the gaps within the language, right? It's not real if it doesn't have a word. So all that is not real to us doesn't exist. It's not that the word doesn't capture it. We don't see that it exists. Now, let's take a little case in point here. So I'm going to call this a green leaf because that's the convention. And so there's a green leaf. And that's what I see there, right? If I look at what is that, it's a green leaf. Now, this same line also defines this black space, right? So that's now I could say that's a green pointed leaf, or I could say that is a map of blackness, right? This here is a map of blackness, now turning white. It looks the size of the, looks a bit like the map of the United States. And then there's this nothing there, there's space. And then there's another map that looks like Mexico, right? So I'm not looking at a green leaf. I'm looking at a complex geometrical shape of black interrupted by nothing. And then I'm seeing another bit of black that I've now kind of filled in with some white. So I could say that that's what I'm seeing. So this would be a language oriented around the definition of space. Now, why are we doing that? Why are we choosing to define and highlight the structure within the space rather than the space that defines the structure? Well, to understand that, it's important to understand why we dumb language down as much as we do. I mean, why don't I describe the 20 trillion movements of subatomic particles that actually are the history of this finger? Why don't I just start talking about that? Well, sub-electron particle A, back around the time of the Big Bang, was doing ding, 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 ding. And while it was doing ding, 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 its next door neighbor was doing ding, 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 ding. And this one was doing this, and then this, that. Why don't I just start on a history of the universe? And by the time that I get to this point, which, because language is so slow, every one of those particles is moving 10,000 times faster than the speed of sound, right? So they're moving fast. So by the time I describe this in sound, it's slowed down so much that it might take me 1 trillion years to describe the movement of one subatomic particle that is part of one atom, that is one little bit of the finger that visited from time to time in the movement of the finger from one particle to another. And I'm going to run out of time. And so this, in other words, reality is more complex, more complicated, then we can possibly, we can maybe vaguely imagine it, but that we can articulate, that we can be conscious of. We can't be conscious of all those things going so fast simultaneously. And so we dumb it down and 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 we dumb it down. And we say, how about a finger? Because there may be 20 trillion things going on in a very complex relationship that's connected this. This atom may have once belonged to all volcanic rock that was ingested by my mother that did this, that made its way through the bloodstream. And now this atom is in this finger for now, right? But that just takes so much time to say all that in words. And so what's a dumbed down version that is crude enough to be able to keep up vaguely with what's actually going on? And we can say the finger is moving. Yeah, the finger's moving. So that's kind of getting close to real time, right? It actually moves, and then we say the finger is moving, so it's really already in the past. But it's getting close to real time. So let's just pretend that is reality, that what I said, that's real, that's close enough. It's less latency, right? Because if I just say everything is, there's not that much latency in that. Everything is, it still is. So you've kind of caught up with reality with that amount of crudeness. But as soon as you say the planet is getting hot, well, it's getting hot in one location, and in another location it's getting cold and is cold. And so, and by that point, those particular interactions have already occurred. And it may still be occurring, but the light photons and stuff that were causing those temperatures that were referenced a moment ago, those have passed through the system, and now it's new photons causing that interaction. So it's still true, but the identities, the patterns of energy that are creating the truth have now changed. So words cannot really keep up with reality. Reality is too complex and too fast. So words are an effort to create a crude map of reality that the conscious mind can keep up with, is a good way of saying it. And 99.9% of the universe is space, beginning with the atomic structure. So an atom is mostly space. Space is mostly space with some stars, some planets, etc., here and there, but it's mostly space. So if the whole point is to describe something crudely and simply so that your conscious mind can catch up with it, even though it's not really very accurate or very real, meaning words are not real and they're not accurate, they're a crude approximation, they're a symbol of reality. And if the goal is to create a symbol of reality that the conscious mind can keep up with, you could describe that whole area as space, but now every piece of space is going to be unique. And so if I have to say, there's a bit of space that's 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters down, then it goes over at 5 degrees, and it comes up here, then it comes up here, and then it comes up there, then the whole point of language, which was to say something quickly and crudely, has been, obfuscated. We're not getting what we wanted, which was a quick and easy approximation of a bit of reality that we think is relevant to our well-being. And so even though there's more space around this leaf than there is leaf, we call it a leaf and we ignore the space, because that simplifies reality. If we just focus on the matter that we can see with our eyes, rather than the matter we can't see with our eyes, which is called space, well then, it makes our life simpler, because there's much less of it. 99% of all that is matter we can see with our eyes. And so we just, in one swoop, by focusing in on things as opposed to the space between things, we get rid of 99% of all the stuff we'd otherwise have to pay attention to and can't keep up with. And so now we have reduced our reality by 99%. We just focus on the thing and ignore the space between the thing. We focus on the second and we ignore the time between the second. We focus on the destination and ignore all the space on the way to the destination. And that brings us to a cruder, dumber version of reality that we can keep up with. And all I have to say is, look at that pointy leaf. And until I do, you don't notice it because there's so many other things to pay attention to. The reality is basically so big that we can never keep up with it. But language is a crude approximation. We take the infinite molecules that are inside this grid here. We just divide them into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. See, now I've got something manageable. The conscious mind can keep track of 18 things. It can't keep track of even one atom and all of its subatomic particles. There's too many and they're moving too fast, but this is pretty stationary, so I can keep up with that. So this is the descent into the delusion of language, where everything is apparently separate from everything else because we're aware of the separation. Meaning we go in and create these maps, and we're aware that everything we're describing in contrast with everything else, and so it looks like every single thing is separate. So once we identify with a separate pattern of energy, that's called the ego, a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being that is unique, that no other pattern of energy is like it. Once we identify with being a separate pattern of energy that is disconnected through language from every other thing, and then once we take the bait from our cult, transferred through the parents, transferred through the government, transferred through religion, transferred through education. Once we take the bait to agree that all that is real is what is refracted in language. Now, we can say our thoughts are real, but you cannot think a thought without language. And then once we take the rewards for calling green red and love abuse and abuse love, now we're trapped in an inverted, crazy-making reality called language. And we feel very, very far away from it all. We feel very separate from all that is. And so going home has a resonance, a sense about it of healing all that separation. So what is coming home? And what is home? So these are all placeholders for very complex energies that we're pretending are distinct, but are in fact interconnected. And the science of that is irrefutable, meaning you cannot take a single thing and isolate it from a single other thing in existence. The finger connects with the hand connects with the arm connects with the body, The body connects with the entire lineage of genetics that produces the body all the way back to the beginning of the planet. The planet connects with the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. 1 minute is inextricably connected to every other minute. 1 moment with every other moment. 1 bit of space with every other space. You cannot isolate anything within reality. In order to isolate something, you have to enter the domain of language. As you create a heuristic, crude map of reality where sounds are linked to crude patterns of energy that the conscious mind can grasp, well, now you can isolate things through the trickery of language. But the idea of going home, which is an idea, so the idea of going away from home, the idea of language is also an idea. So in order to kind of get a sense of what home looks like, we have some clues in mythology. For example, there was the garden. That's the unbroken whole. That's grace. And we fell out of the garden into the knowledge of good and evil. We fell from the 1 into 2. Now, the 2 is just words, right? We fell into the knowledge of good and evil. We didn't fall into good and evil. We fell into the knowledge of distinction. And once you start playing the numbers game, once you start playing the verbal game, then the body becomes 1,000 indistinct parts of the body. You know, you spend time with a doctor, a dentist, for example, and there's the corona, and there's this, and there's that. It's a mouth, it's teeth, right? But that's not distinct enough. You can get more and more and more and more distinct, endlessly distinct. You can take a grayscale, where this is dark gray and this is light gray, and you can create more than 1 trillion colors between those 2 continuums, just dark and light gray. Just keep cutting them in half, keep cutting them in half. So this is the illusion of distinction. This is the knowledge of separation. And the separation comes from language. Now, when you enter the knowledge of good and evil, you generate 50% waste, because once you pair the idea that evil is bad and half of everything that is bad, is evil, and that the thing to do with a bad thing is to get rid of it, is to bury it, is to hide it, is to banish it. That's what you do with a bad thing. Now, one has created a tug of war, where half of reality is fighting the other half of reality. Because what is good has to get rid of what is bad. Now, you can also create punishing deities with language. It's very easy. You create images with language. You put those images in the top of the hierarchy described by language. And since good people would never be angry or violent or anything, you just make an angry, punishing, violent deity. that does all the things that you aren't. Because if it's bad to be violent and angry and self-centered, if it's bad to be that, then I can't be that, right? But you have to get rid of all those things that are angry and self-centered. So if they're angry and self-centered, they don't listen to you, right? They don't, so then you need to create another force that will punish and banish the bad things inside and out. And so war emerges out of language with the knowledge of polarity, the knowledge of good and evil, and the idea that in order to have a better world, we have to get rid of half of what is. Because it's very important to understand that whenever you create a polarity, it is equal. Meaning, you take one and you divide it by two. Now you have two halves. And one half is never bigger or smaller than another half. So as you divide the one into two, you create two equal halves. If you then superimpose the paradigm that half is bad and half is good, and then you superimpose the paradigm of punishment, discipline, of shame, now you say that half of who you are and half of all of reality is shameful, is bad, should be punished. Now, by whom, right? This begs the question, by whom? Because is the bad half of reality going to punish itself? Right? So if half of reality is bad and has no redeeming qualities, then how's it going to punish itself? Like, this has no character, it's unredeemable, it's bad. And what should happen to bad things is they should be punished. By whom? Who's going to outcast the bad things? The bad parts of you, the bad parts of reality? Who's gonna get rid of them? Who's gonna bury them? Who's gonna pretend they don't exist? Who's gonna kick them out of the party? Now, the inescapable answer is the good things, the good people. The good people are gonna fight and kill and banish and humiliate and shame the bad people. The good parts of us, right, are going to get rid of the bad parts of us. Go away, you horrible part, go away. Don't come back. We never want to see you again. We're not going to give you any love and support. You're not welcome here. And that's the good part, right? The good part is going to do that to the bad part. Why? Because they deserve it, right? That's another paradigm, deservability. It's just words. You invent up the paradigm of deservability by saying that there is a thing called deservability. And who deserves? The bad people deserve? No. You invent that too. So the good people deserve. There's a thing called deservability. Who said so? Language. And the good people get what they deserve, which is good things. And the bad people get what they deserve, which is bad things. So if bad things are happening to you, then you deserve bad things. Now, that's a loop, right? It's an invention, deservability, and it's a loop, goes round and round. How do you know you're bad? Because bad things have happened. How do you know you deserve bad things? Because bad things happened to you. And what does bad things happening to you mean? It means you deserved it. And why did you deserve it? Because you're bad. And so that's why bad things happen to you. Because you deserve it, because you're bad. There's no outside reference there. So, another invention into language. It's bad because it's bad. Now, in a discipline framework, there is some reference to the continuum of human well-being. Why are you bad? Well, you're doing things that create chronic and unnecessary suffering. And why are you good? Because you're doing things, usually because what you're told, but theoretically you're doing things that create sustainable well-being. So you're good, right? So there's a reference point. Look, you left the stove on, now your 2-year-old sister is burnt. You shouldn't have left the stove on because I said so. And now your 2-year-old sister is burnt and you're bad, right? Because she's suffering because you're bad. Because if you didn't do that, then she wouldn't be suffering. So there's usually a link between bad and unnecessary suffering. And of course, the idea is that the one who made the mistake is bad. So when you partition things into language, you create you create the ability to scapegoat. See, when all things are interconnected, you cannot scapegoat. But when this is delusionarily created as a fake partition, this is here and this is there, then you can play the game that this has nothing to do with this. Saddam Hussein may have been brutalized by his father, may have been left alone with a sadistic father, may have been chronically traumatized in a world that knew how to traumatize him, but did not know how to heal the trauma it caused. Saddam Hussein may have learned that the best way to avoid chronic abuse is to become the tyrant that always won in the child-parent relationship. And that the best way to feel better in a world that lacked empathy for him as a child was to create that level of terror, pain, and suffering for various people that threatened his identity, his pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. That may have happened, but we're just not going to look at any of that equation. We're not going to look at the fact that in every neighborhood there are chronically abused children who are so frightened of giants based on the experience they've had with them that they don't even ask for help, who are being terrified into silence, and that we're going along with it because it frightens us to confront an abuser, to stand up for a child, because it would take a little effort to champion a world of parental literacy, where you might have to take a test in order to be given permission to raise a child unsupervised. You know, the evidence is clear. There are plenty of incompetent parents who are being given innocence to warp and mangle into a replica of their own family abuse system. You can do anything about that for a single child? Well, see, one or two of those children is the next Saddam Hussein, is the next President Trump, is the next Putin. Someone that learns that there is no empathy that can be ultimately relied on. Only power, only being on top. And that the only reason people do things is ultimately out of fear. And the only way to get people to fear you is to do cruel things. So the only way to climb to the top of the power pyramid is to be able and willing to do cruel things to people that oppose you, and to have as many people afraid of you as possible, so that you had ultimate power, so that nobody could hurt you again. You know, that's a meme. That's a pattern that we teach, that we model to children. You see, dad lies and mom tries to confront him, but she doesn't have as much power. If he won't, you know, if every time she confronts him, he hits her and freezes the bank account until she apologizes for confronting the abuse, then that's what you learn. That's the thing that works, that there's the abused one that doesn't have power, and there's the powerful one that abuses to sustain that power. And in a system where nobody does anything about that, then the system replicates. Every child becomes a copy of the parental system. And in highly abusive families, the rebellion of the adolescent doesn't take place because it is punished so severely. And so one actually kills off the inner warrior because it results in more chronic pain. One's body alerts one that if one fights, one could get killed. But if one accepts the abuse, one will survive in slavery without dignity and honor, but still survive in a relationship of separation, of contempt. Well, these are all parts of the descent. These are all parts of the descent, as is the scapegoating of the tyrant and the scapegoating of the victim, because they're the same thing. You don't have tyrants without unhealed victims. You don't have victims without sociopathic tyrants. They're the same thing. It's a virus. You don't have chickens without eggs. You don't have eggs without chickens. And so the question is that particular virus going to pervade? And to what degree? What's required to evolve that virus? But it is a virus of separation. It is a virus where the cult patterns that ensure a large percentage of parental illiteracy are ignored, and the parents that by whatever random or rational method are evaluated as individuals rather than part of a field. In other words, if you take 100 million people and you teach them algebra and how to read and write, and you give them the current news media and advertising media, and you tell the men not to cry, not to have feelings, and you shame and patronize women for having feelings, and you don't teach any emotional literacy, and you don't teach any traumatic literacy, and you don't teach any relational literacy, and you play out a sociopathic power dynamic where the bottom line is fear, and the fear is of pain, and where the most powerful people in the power system transfer their pain onto the most vulnerable, the smallest and the weakest in the power system, of fear. And you just do that to 100 million people. And then you notice how many of those 100 million people become highly competent, empathic parents. How many people just copy whatever was done to them or make some minor improvements? And how many chronically abuse their children in a variety of ways? Giving them a diet that creates obesity and that doesn't help regulate emotion, giving a diet of behavior and media watching that does not create physical brain health, creating schizophrenia by this artificial bifurcation of the good people and the bad people, and the good family members and the bad family members, when anyone with a brain can see that those at the top of the power structure are creating the probability field. You know, to blame the individual is very similar to asking gamblers leaving Vegas why they lost money, rather than saying, why did they go to Vegas? Right? Because that would be a different question. Why did you go to the American cult for parental guidance, on how to raise children, when it's such a disaster? Why did you go to Vegas when 98% of people leave Vegas with less money than they arrived with? That's a statistic. That's a probability field. It has nothing to do with the individual. Meaning, you can, as an individual, figure out how to beat Vegas and be one of the 2% winners. But you can far easily just not go to Vegas and gamble, and instead put money into real estate. So 90% of all people in real estate make money. 98% of all people who go to Vegas and gamble lose money. It's a much bigger variable. So you can complain to all 100 people leaving Vegas, why didn't they beat the system and learn 10 years of blackjack and do this and do that? Or you can ask, what's this game here that's being set up where most people are losers, and in fact, where Vegas would shut down and go bankrupt if people came away and won? Meaning people go to Vegas to win, but if they actually did, there would be no Vegas. The only, all the billions that you see in Vegas is built on the losses of individuals. So the bigger and more impressive it is, the more people lost money there. And that has very little to do with the individual if you want to change the dynamic. Meaning you get much better results saying, close down Vegas, or let's look at why you're going to Vegas knowing that you're almost certainly going to lose money. Why are you playing a losing game when there's real estate? Admittedly, there's a bribe, right? Your adrenaline, you can get lots more adrenaline and excitement and stuff than you can mopping the floor after a tenant. So the descent into hell, the descent into language has a lot to do with cutting reality up into pieces and then grading those pieces with a better than, less than paradigm, with a good bad paradigm, with an overlay that the bad deserve shame and punishment and the good deserve exoneration and the righteousness to kill and punish the bad. You know, St. George killed the dragon. The dragon was bad. You know, the Crusaders, the Christian Crusaders, killed the heathens, broke up the families of the Native American Indians because they were bad. Now, given the human drive to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse, and given the extreme amount of trauma, pain, and fear of that pain repeating itself, that I and all of us live in to one degree or another, the question is, where did we go wrong? And, you know, how do we go back home? Because at one time, things were all connected. At one time, there was a harmonious ecology. At one time, the world was not divided into two camps at war with one another. And that's really the question. And it's a paradox, right? Because the way home is to transcend duality, is to transcend language, is to understand that we've never left the one. We've just superimposed a grid that obscures our innate connection with all that is. Because every individual, and that is a word, every part of the whole is innately connected with every other part of the whole. And so a lot of the suffering that is created with words. And it's created with paradigms, paradigms of punishment, paradigms of isolation, paradigms of good and bad. And the paradigms that disconnected us from ourselves are not the paradigms that will help us return. Within the paradigm of punishment, if the bully punishes the victim, then justice is for the victim to punish the bully. But outside of the paradigm, which is a word, of punishment, the paradigm of healing is, what is the loop of abuse that the bully is in? And if we understand that process, it works like this. The bully was once a small and helpless child and dependent on the giant. And the giant felt like a small, helpless child on the inside. The giant was regressed. The giant was incompetent as a small, helpless child and transferred those feelings onto the small child. The small child being beaten, being humiliated, unable to move, unable to escape the dynamic, felt too much shame, too much pain, too much loneliness, too much hurt, identifying as the small child. And so the small child switched identities. The small child identified with the giant. One day I am going to be the one doing this and doing this and doing this, and no one's going to make me feel this helpless. And during the beating, identified with the one beating them, because it was too overwhelming to feel so small, so separate, so alone. Now, what happens when the bully sees a small, helpless child is empathy starts to draw them towards the helplessness in the small, helpless child. And it reminds them of their own helplessness, their own smallness that was too big to deal with and survive as a child, as an infant. And so they do what they did to survive then. They transfer their empathy for the small one towards the hostility and power of the big one. And in order not to feel the feeling of helplessness, of powerlessness, and in order not to have their identity broken, they reenact the bullying, identifying with the bully, projecting that the victim is themselves. And so within the paradigm of revenge, who do you take revenge on? Within the paradigm of good and bad, who's the good one, who's the bad one? Because how is it that the bully was surrendered as an infant to a bully to such a degree that they dissociated from their own infancy and innocence and clung to the most solid thing around them provided by the cult in the form of an abusive giant that is sanctioned, meaning we all know that perhaps 10% to 50% of all of the child-parent interactions are highly suboptimal. There are secrets involved that a child shouldn't be asked to carry. There's shame and humiliation and terror that a child shouldn't be asked to carry. There are lies and betrayals that are very difficult for a child to deal with and maintain empathy. There's sexual abuse, brutality, and there's abandonment. Your nice parent, you ask them if they could help your friend, and your nice parent doesn't want to see the abuse that your fellow 10-year-old is going through. And the 10-year-old worries about how your parent feels. Don't worry, I'll deal with it, says the 10-year-old. Because your parent is a coward. Because your parent is more worried about inconveniencing their luxurious life than they are about a 10-year-old having to deal with a giant. In other words, if we're in a sociopathic cult of turning away from the small one in need until they become the giant that dominates, is anyone not a participant in that pattern? So, if you really want to change the pattern, you might confront all of the people watching TV in your neighborhood who are pretending they're not part of the pattern. That's really the big battle, is to get all of the dissociated people who have created distinctions and partitions to pretend that they have nothing to do with what's going on in their neighborhood. And actually say, you do actually have everything to do with what's going on in your neighborhood by remaining parentally incompetent yourself, by remaining traumatically illiterate yourself, by not reading the statistics and by not responding. You are actively creating child abuse in your neighborhood, and it is happening, and you don't want to know about it, and kids are protecting your comfort because you're a coward. And if you don't want to deal with that, then don't deal with it, but that's actually what's going on. If we want to stop childhood abuse, we've got to stop you from being so fucked up and sociopathic. And that's the majority, right? The minority, the victim and the perpetrator in any given moment, are the tip of the iceberg. And shaming and ostracizing and punishing them isn't going to do anything. It's just going to compel deeper and deeper levels of secrecy and isolation for the child and the perpetrator. Right? So the paradigm doesn't work. The paradigm of good and bad doesn't work. To the extent that we want to heal is to the extent that we need to understand our innate connection. To the extent that we want to heal sociopathic denial and dissociation by the majority from the minority, to the extent that we can understand just how much pain and fear is underneath that veneer of passivity. That these people are turning away from parts of themselves. And it's about creating microcultures that do something about that. That we are also turning away and have turned away so many times from the parts of ourselves that the inner bully, that the inner critic has attacked. It's not about what's going on out there, it's about what's going on in here. And it's not about what's going on in here, it's about what's going on out there. There is no connection, there's no distinction. So going home is about dissolving the partitions, the walls that keep us dissociated from ourselves, from one another. And to do that also means healing ourselves so that we're reconnected with all that is. Because there is an infinite amount of energy in life, in all that is. The question is, are we connected to it, or are we dissociated from it? I don't deserve that. I don't have a right to that. I don't belong. I'm not lovable. Why? Because an entire cult colluded in my abuse and doesn't want to look at it. So it must be my fault. Must be my fault. So what is home? Home is reconnecting the one with the one, the particle with the field, the masculine with the feminine, because that's just another polarity. At the heart of all masculine energy is feminine energy. At the heart of all feminine energy is masculine energy. And so it's a wonderful symbol to to understand this dance of polarity. That the one is divided into two in such a way that the very heart of the partition is the opposite. And you can see this with communication, for example. The masculine expression of communication is to speak. The feminine expression is to receive and to listen and to allow the words to change us. To speak and to change us. And yet to allow is to speak, because we choose what we allow. We choose what we allow in. The allowing has a shape to it, just as the speaking has a shape. And we cannot speak and connect without noticing, without listening. And if we don't listen, we don't touch people with our words. We can listen to their face. We can listen to their presence. We don't touch people with our words without listening to everything. See, if we listen deeply enough, a few words make all the difference. If we speak without listening, we don't actually speak. To speak is to touch someone. If we have not listened, we cannot touch. We cannot speak. If we don't think, which is a form of speech, because we think through language, we cannot listen. Meaning the listening puts things into words and into sensations. We become conscious of our listening with words. Oh, they mean this. Oh, it seems like this is what's going on. Meaning we ground the meaning of what we're listening to through speaking. If we don't reflect what we're hearing with language, we don't actually hear. And people often don't feel heard unless we say back to them things that help them understand that we get not just the words they're saying, but the pattern that the words are referencing. And we do that by referencing the pattern that they're referencing using slightly different words that are consistent with the same pattern that their words are referencing. And people say, yes, you get it. And now we're referencing a similar pattern. A pattern that is created by language. So we have patterns inside of patterns inside of patterns. And the life cycle seen within patterns, the breath, for example, the in-breath is followed by the out-breath. And so the understanding of patterns, now that we're in them, now that we're looking at the world with patterns, understanding patterns, the understanding of patterns is important in the sense that everything is a cycle, everything is a breath. And if at the end of an exhale, I tell myself, come on, let's really breathe out deeply. I can't do it. I've got to breathe in. At the end of an inhale, I say, come on now, let's take a deep breath in. I can't do it. I've got to be attuned with the cycle, The car wheel moving forward is going around and around. Every point on the circle is sacred For a car to move, it has to transit through each point in the circle. But if I got the cycle wrong, and here's the ground, and this point needs to make contact, but I ask this point to make contact because my system is I have a faulty map, then I'm going to ask the car to go backwards. But if I ask for this point to make contact while I want the car to go forward, and I don't understand that my system is faulty, my map is faulty, then I'm going to shame the driver, the car, everything but myself, right? And so, this also, I think, is an important thing to understand. That if something goes wrong in our life, everything in our life, as we've defined what's going wrong, is a participant, including us. Meaning, because if we can't escape the wrong thing, then we could say that I am incompetent to escape the wrong thing. If I couldn't see the wrong thing coming, we could say I am blind to see the wrong thing coming. That blindness and incompetence is a participant in being stuck in the wrong thing. Now, the wrong thing, you could say, is a participant in getting stuck. And the cult that bred blindness and incompetence is part of that thing getting stuck. But going home is about transcending these things. It's about moving from the extremes. So on the continuum of any polarity, you have the extremes. And at any given point, we're not fully in balance. We're in kind of leaning towards something. And so moving towards the place of balance is part of the breath, is part of life, is part of going back home. Because as we move towards center, we move towards grace in our relationship with all that is. We move towards ease. We move towards conscious, sustainable fun. And in doing so, we're able to allow and accept more of what is. Because as we move too far in one extreme or another, the pain, the disconnection becomes so strong that we have to disconnect from ourselves and reality. And then ultimately we have to fight the system that's producing that level of pain, because that system becomes our enemy for producing that pain. Now we're at war with a portion of ourselves. So grace is seeing, learning, growing enough to move into center with the system and teaching that to more and more of reality around us, so that there doesn't need to be a war. It's about creating new protocols that bring the traumatic pain down to a certain point, where the empathic operating system can be contacted, can be touched without excruciating pain, coming online. The empathic operating system is who's in the most pain, how can we help? Who's in the most potential of well-being, how can we celebrate and support? That's the empathic operating system. It requires competency and new technology. It is natural. It takes a certain amount of competency to create superabundance at a level where empathy becomes the dominant operating system. And that's when we start to feel more at home with ourselves and at home with each other. And as things become more and more beautiful, more and more true and good, the distinctions become less relevant. And the grace becomes more relevant. We feel more and more love and acceptance of all that is, which means we feel more and more love and acceptance of ourself, because no thing is distinct from any other thing. No person, no one is distinct from any other thing. You can follow the threads on so many dimensions between any point and every other point that can be imagined, that there is a healing, which is a return to the awareness of wholeness. Shame is the awareness of separation. Sociopathic behavior creates the pain that is shamed and separated from. Empathic behavior, awareness, science, wonder, reconnects everything. In the ecology that we have never left, except in our conscious minds through the descent into language. So, this is a set of words that remind us of the prism and prison of words, and point us in a direction that takes us a little bit closer to going home, to being home where we have always been.